Warm greetings to you all, our friends from around the world. Welcome to today's MEI webinar, Metadata, your link to get books discovered, bought, and read globally. This is Ramon Rocha of MEI. MEI's work is to come alongside global Christian writers and publishers so they could create and publish original life-transforming materials that edify the church and impact society. We're glad to see 46 of our friends from 20 countries register for this webinar. Let me just mention the countries represented. From Africa, we have Kenya, Ghana, Swaziland, Benin, South Africa, Nigeria, and DR Congo. From Europe, we have Great Britain, France, Russia, Ukraine, and Albania. From Asia, we have the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, and Hong Kong. From North and South America, the US, Brazil, and Argentina. Thank you especially for joining us, for those of you joining us live today. We welcome your comments and questions. Please use the chat for your comments and the Q&A for your questions. Joshua Talent will answer all of your questions after his presentation. Well, what is metadata? Should I care? Good question. That's why we're having this webinar today. I Googled, and Oxford Dictionary defines metadata as a set of data that describes and gives information about other data. Clear? Yes? No? Thank God we have a top-notch expert to explain to us what metadata is and how important maintaining quality metadata could help our writers and publishers get their books discovered, bought, and read globally. Today, we are blessed to have Joshua Talent, the Director of Sales and Education at Firebrand Technologies. Their landing page says, Firebrand is a technology company that helps publishers make books succeed. Joshua also hosts podcasts, Booksmart's podcast. And I've been listening to your podcast, Joshua, since your first episode last March. Joshua is a techie guy who enjoys complex board games, Minecraft, and home automation. Maybe we could see robots around your house. Thank you, Joshua, for being with us this morning, and please take it away.
Thank you very much, Ramon. Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you with us today. And yeah, as was mentioned, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A box or the chat box, and try to keep those visible in case I need them. But I'll get to those questions at the end if necessary. So yeah, as Ramon mentioned, it's kind of funny. Metadata is a very interesting topic, very misunderstood in many ways. So let's dive right in and let's talk about what is metadata. Metadata, as was mentioned, it's data about data. It's information about your books. When you think about it from an Amazon product page, for example, you have information on this page that is considered metadata. Things like the title of the book, the author's name, the book description, the the cover of the book, the price of the book, all of these other types of pieces. These are all considered metadata. They are information about your book that helps your book be found and discovered, and also helps people recognize why they would want to purchase it. So we're going to talk today about metadata and go through some details about how you can create more metadata, better metadata for your books, and how that can impact you as you go through the publishing process. So you will get a copy of the slides after the presentation, so don't feel like you have to scribble notes. And we're also obviously recording it, so hopefully you can watch that again if you need to as well. So let's talk about, first of all, why is metadata important? What is it about metadata that makes it an important part of the publishing process? I usually point to a couple of studies that have been done about this topic because I feel like they are the most beneficial for publishers who are trying to understand this process. The first is a Nielsen study. Nielsen Book was it's a research company based here in the U.S. They were actually purchased by NPD back about 3 or 4 years ago, I think. But in 2016, they published a report called The Importance of Metadata for Discovery and Sales. And I want to show you a couple of key details that they found in their research. Now, firstly, they looked at 2.5 million different books that were recorded during a 12-month period from July 2015 to June 2016. And of those 2.5 million books, every single one of them had at least one sale. And these numbers are from the US, but there's other studies in the UK, and I'll show you one of those here in just a minute. So of those 2.5 million different books, they looked at the top 100,000 titles. What they found was that the top 100,000 titles, which is only 4% of that 2.5 million ISBNs, had recorded sales during that period that were 86% of the total book sales, unit sales over that same period. So when you look at that, what's actually selling, how many books, actual physical books are being sold by different publishers, you want to be in that top 100,000, right? You want your books to show up in that top 4%. That's where the majority of sales, of actual unit sales, ended up happening. So what they did was they took those unit sales, that top 100,000 titles, and they broke that list down by the quality of the metadata. How did the metadata have an impact, or could it have an impact on those books? So what they found, first of all, was that titles with the most basic level of metadata, they had an ISBN, a title, the format was defined, the publication date was put on there. They had at least one BISAC subject code. They had their retail price and sales rights and cover image and the contributor, the author information. That basic level of metadata, those that had all of those points had average sales 75% higher than those that didn't have everything. What's surprising to me, actually, is that there were titles in that top 100,000 that didn't have some points in the basic metadata list, just foundational metadata. So I guess that's in some ways a good sign that at least you can still make sales if you don't have good metadata, but you definitely have higher sales if you do. Next thing that they found was that for fiction titles, that number was actually much higher. So those with that basic level of metadata that were in the fiction category were actually 170% higher sales than those that did not have that. So if you write fiction, if you publish fiction, this is obviously really important for you. Also, they found that titles that include a cover image have sales that are 51% higher than those without. And that makes sense. It's kind of a logical point. If you don't have a cover image, a lot of times it makes it difficult for consumers to like the book or know that the book is going to be what they want, because we do judge books by their cover. They also found that titles with all three descriptive data elements, the book description, the author bio, and reviews, if it had all three of those items, then it saw average sales that were 72% higher than those with no descriptive data attached to them. And then lastly, what they looked at was keywords. And they found that titles with keywords see average sales 34% higher than titles with no keywords. Now, this was a study that was done 5 years ago. So things have changed with keywords over the years, but 34% higher sales, that's a pretty good number for keywords, especially 5 years ago. Okay, so that was the US study done in 2016. And again, all these different points are how many book sales happened as a result of metadata that was, or can be correlated in some way to metadata that was available in the book. So in 2020, last year, Nielsen in the UK did a different study, again called The Importance of Metadata for Discovery and Sales. But this one was in the UK based on UK data. And this was all from data before the pandemic. So back in 2019 is when they pulled the data and were comparing it. So they looked at, again, the same kind of thing. And what they found was a couple of things that were very similar to what they had found in the US in 2016. First, they found that books with complete bibliographic records, things that they had a foundational, again, that basic level of metadata, sell on average more than twice the number of books than those with incomplete records. So if you have good foundational metadata, you're more likely to sell more books. They also found that the required standard for products might be a little different. It's usually for most publishers, they send out the data about their books about 16 weeks or so ahead of publication. So somewhere around the 4 to 6 month mark is pretty common for publishers. Their analysis of the top 100,000 bestsellers revealed that the average sale of a book that met that timeliness, that was available 16 weeks beforehand, was 44% higher than the average sale of books that didn't meet that timeliness or meet the criteria at all. So if you make your books available for sale before, especially for pre-order, put the information out, for 16 weeks, 4 months or so before the book is available for sale. Put that information out early. It starts to build the visibility of the title. It starts to get people thinking about it. It starts to change how people see it. And that can make a big impact on your sales as well. Another thing that they found was that the average sale of a book with at least one BIC code, and BIC is the basically the subject categorization system over in the UK. It's similar to BISAC here in the US or Thema in other parts of the world. So the average sale of a book with at least one subject code was more than 3 times the sales of books without. You have to have subject codes on your books. It makes a huge difference as to how people find your book and make sure that it's available in the right place. They also found that books and consumer survey found that 17.7% of book buyers cited that the description of the book was a reason behind their purchase behavior. And you'd think 17.7%, well, that's not a huge percentage, but it's actually, of all the reasons people said they made a decision to buy a book, that was the most cited reason, was the book description. So you have to have a really great book description on your book. This is actually a higher percentage of people who said the book description mattered than people who said the book's front cover mattered, or that the book had won an award, or that it appeared in a bestseller chart, or even whether it was priced low or had some sort of special offer. So when you're looking at your book metadata, book descriptions can be very, very important. So very, very important for you to take a look at that and see if you can make a good quality description. When talking about keywords, what they saw was on average, books in the top 100,000 for the 2019 year with keyword records, anything that had a keyword record at all, it doesn't matter how many keywords it had. If it had keywords that sold more than 2,300 copies on average, and that was compared to those that didn't have keywords that had just under 1,000 copies on average. So more than double the number of copies were sold for titles that had keywords in their metadata. They also found that compliance with having keywords was about 57%. And that's grown quite a bit since back in 2016, when the other Nielsen study was done, and when other studies were done years ago, back when compliance was probably about 20 or 25%. So we're seeing more and more publishers put product keywords into their metadata. And that's an important thing, because when you do, you can make your books more visible and therefore lead to more sales. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. They also found that the average sale of a book in 2019 in that top 100,000 with a complete author biography was almost double the sales of those with an author, but no author biography. So you need to have an author bio included in your metadata because author bios are very helpful for helping people understand who this person is and why should they care about that person in the book that they've written. Okay, so that's some of the reasons why I think metadata is important. I also like to point out, especially because we have such a diverse group of people here, that online sales and backlist sales are obviously a big part of how metadata can help you and why metadata is important. So let's continue in this path of talking about why metadata is important for just another minute here. And talk about what online sales and backlist title sales do and how that works. So the first thing is we know that online sales are growing, right? In 2020, just by itself, online sales grew 43%. And that's obviously a result here. And these are numbers from the US, but I'm obviously around the world, this has had an impact as well. But with online sales growing, it's not just a result of the pandemic. There's obviously a lot of that happened, and this is online sales in general grew by 43% as a result of the pandemic in 2020. But those numbers are not going to change dramatically. People are going to go back and start buying things in stores, but they have, what most researchers are saying today is that people who started buying things from online in 2020 as a result of the pandemic and not being able to go to the store, a lot of those people are going to continue buying things online because they found it to be beneficial and easy and a quick way to find what they want to find. So when you're thinking about how do I sell my books, how do I make sure my books are more visible, metadata becomes that much more important in an online arena than it does in, say, a print store. Now let's talk about backlist. So what is the backlist? The backlist is obviously titles that have been available for sale for longer than a year, according to most people. If you look at MPD and what they say about backlist sales, they usually say it's anything that's at least a year old. What's interesting is that publishers typically have better sales from their backlist than they do from their front list. Now, obviously, sometimes that doesn't that doesn't match because some publishers, they really push that front list title and they have a big name author or something like that, and they drive a ton of sales. So in Canada, the BookNet Canada did a study just recently looking at titles in the backlist, trying to figure out what's the range of backlist sales. And what they found was that titles in the 2 to 5 year range actually had better sales than those that were just over a year old or over 5 years old. So that 2 to 5 years old range is a pretty good range to be watching for your backlist. Pay attention to those titles that are in that age range, have been, were published 2 to 5 years ago, and try to put more push behind the metadata, more emphasis behind that metadata, because it can make a big impact on those titles as well. And this makes sense logically too. If you think about it, sometimes a book comes out, it gets a lot of press and things kind of happen. And so, sure, you're going to get quite a few sales during that front list title time period. But then after a year or two, when you're no longer doing your major marketing pushes, a lot of times you'll see this is where the data actually starts to pick up, because people have started talking about that book in online forums or on Facebook or Twitter or whatever else. People have read the book and they're recommending it to their friends. And so there's a little bit more time for things to get caught up in that. And also, it's important to think about backlist title sales just from a general perspective. And this is the growth of backlist title sales as a percentage of total book sales. And a lot of publishers don't even think about this, that even back as far as 2015, the percentage of sales that were made up by backlist titles was already 57%, but that grew to 67% by 2020. And then over the last couple of years, it's gone up at least another 22% year over year as a result of the pandemic and other things going on. So, in the first 2 months of 2020, print backlist sales were already up 22% over 2020. So, and there's speculation that the shift to online sales is going to continue to be in place despite changes as the economies start opening up again and things start to come back. So pay attention to your backlist titles. This is very important. And this is where metadata becomes that much more important. Okay, so let's talk about the metadata issues that you will run into. And I'm going to get to some best practices here in a minute and give you some pointers on how to make things better with your data. But I want to talk to you about some of the issues that you're guaranteed to run into, or very likely to run into at least, in the industry, and things that you should be aware of as you think about building out your metadata program and how to consider the data that you're sending where it needs to go. The first issue you'll run into is that every trading partner, every retailer that's out there, everybody that receives your data is going to be a unicorn with its own custom metadata requirements. They just want their own stuff in their own way. They're very, very picky. And trading partners are notoriously bad at just saying, just give me the data the way I want it, instead of just taking the data the way you want to deliver it. When you start thinking about this from a practical perspective, it can mean that data elements are not accepted and shown by retailers the way you expect them to. This is a study I did a couple of years ago, just looking at some of the top online retailers here in the US and trying to figure out, or here in North America, and trying to figure out what parts of the data, what metadata elements do they actually show on their website. And what I found was basically that Amazon and Barnes and Noble are obviously doing the best job with showing the data that's being delivered to them by publishers. And other retailers are kind of hit or miss as to whether they show things the way you would expect them to. What it also means is that some online stores still have a hard time figuring out how to sell books and kind of what to do with the data that they're receiving from publishers. And in some cases, that leads to some really bad quality stuff happening. Here's an example of something that I've seen before on certain retail sites where they change things in the data as it's being delivered to them, and they turn HTML code into visible text on their screen and do things like this that just don't help anybody, right? It causes lots of problems. It makes the text unreadable. This is a review quote from a title. And so when you start thinking about, well, what's my data going to look like? What's going to happen to your books as they go out online and people start doing stuff? This is the kind of thing you have to pay attention to and watch for in your data. Another thing that you can run into is delivery time. The data that I'm showing here comes from, again, a test that I ran back in fall 2019 with a bunch of different titles from different publishers across the different retail sites, just testing how long does it take for that metadata to actually show up on their website. So we put out a bunch of metadata updates, and then we tested and saw how long it took. Amazon was very quick, and Goodreads was kind of fast, but Barnes & Noble took a week. Indigo took about a week, and Walmart took about 5 days. Powell's didn't even take the data and update it. So you can see that on average, it can take between 3 to 5 days in many cases, and sometimes even longer than that, for all of the data that you sent to a retailer to show up on their website. And that for you might be a problem as a publisher. Oh, I need to change some bit of information that's incorrect. I need to tweak the book description to change something or reference something new. You have to keep that in mind as you're thinking through, how do I send my data? How quickly will it get ingested? It can cause some delays, and you have to be careful about that. One of the biggest issues that we run into in the world of publishing is the publisher's metadata being overwritten by other parties. Now, normally we would prefer that this right here, what you see on the screen, being the standard supply chain for metadata. The publisher sends out the official data. It goes out to all these different locations where it needs to go. And that's that. But the problem is that this flowchart is actually not accurate to the realities of the real world. The real world is, unfortunately, a lot messier. And this is what you can see. So what you give a retailer can easily be overwritten by someone else. And in some cases, this is done days or even hours after you send out the updated data yourself. It's really almost like the Wild West out there. There are distributors and metadata aggregators like Bowker, wholesalers, and even outside sources like authors that can provide data to your retailers that overwrite what you sent them yourself. So one of our clients ran headlong into this overriding issue a couple of years ago. An old distributor in the UK sent Amazon in the US title data for 400 of that publisher's titles. And this was a mistake on the distributor's part because they were no longer the distributor of those books, but they had a data issue on their side and they resent a bunch of data they shouldn't have. And normally this wouldn't be something that would be a problem, but Amazon, because they got the data from that distributor, thought the distributor was taking over distribution again, and they gave that distributor control over all 400 of those titles, and then started sending them orders for new copies of the book. And the distributor obviously rejected those orders because they don't sell the book, but Amazon never checked with the publisher to see who the vendor of record was supposed to be and make sure that that wasn't changed, was changed back to where it was supposed to be. And it took a lot of effort for that publisher to get the titles returned to them as the supplier. So this is where you run into a big issue here. How do you manage the data being sent where it needs to go? And how do I ensure that what the data that I as a publisher send out is going to be accepted as the appropriate data? All right, so let's go on. In 2012, the Book Industry Study Group, which is an organization here in the U.S. That is over the industry organization over the book industry, commissioned a report on the development, use, and modification of book product metadata. And this obviously is almost 10 years old now, but the study found that 95% of publishers say that their metadata is altered without their knowledge on retail sites by third parties like distributors and metadata aggregators. So 95% of publishers know that their data is being overwritten by somebody else, like we saw in that last slide. However, the study also found that only 36% of publishers go out and manually check the metadata on retailer sites. And this, obviously, the number may have changed in the last 9 years or so, but I can guarantee you that the majority of publishers are still not checking their titles regularly or watching them regularly. So it's imperative that you watch the titles in the marketplace, that you pay attention to changes that may impact your book sales, and all those things that we've been talking about. Okay, let's move on and talk about some best practices for your book metadata. And we will come back to questions here in a minute. So first of all, book descriptions. So book descriptions are obviously very important. They do matter. The description, the author bio, and the reviews saw 72% higher sales in that Nielsen US study. In the UK study, it's 144% increase in unit sales if you have a long description than if you don't. And remember, the highest percentage of people, of book buyers, cited the description of the book as a reason behind their purchase. So having a good quality book description will make a big difference in how people see your book and how they think about your book and whether they want to purchase your book. So the first recommendation I have is to keep the book description to about 2 or 3 paragraphs. Now, I see a lot of publishers who write a very small book description, just 1 paragraph, very small, especially for nonfiction titles. I see that a lot. My recommendation is to have 2 or 3 paragraphs of information about the book. But in addition to that, you have to make sure, if you're selling on Amazon, that you keep your information above the fold as the most important. So there's basically on the Amazon product page, there's a piece of information that's about 1 paragraph long that shows up without me having to click on anything. And so make sure that you keep that information above the fold, but do write a longer description for your book. Now, again, this is where we get into some questions. How long is long enough? How long is too long? The more words, the better is really the way I would recommend it. At least 200 words or up to 500 is what the UK study from 2020 said. So what they found was that when you have a book description that's up to 500 words and at least 200 words, that's a good sweet spot for a book description as far as book sales were concerned. Another point to consider is don't go too long. Even if you go over the 500 words, make sure that you're not that you're under the 4,000 character limit on Amazon. Now that's just an Amazon limitation, but it's also just a good standard to remember. So if you go up to 500 words, make sure you're under 4,000 characters. Another thing to consider with your book description is to do a lead-in as the first paragraph. So lead-in is that bolded paragraph or sentence at the top of your book description. Typically, it's just 1 sentence, maybe 2, that's on its own, that's bolded, that kind of stands out. And it's something that people will want to, something to encourage people to read this book or to continue reading the description. It might be, if it's a fiction title, it might be that really key thing about what happens in the book. Who is this character? What is the main thrust of the book? Or it may be a review. If you've got a really great review, you might put that as your lead in at the top of that book description as well. That being said, I usually recommend that you don't include reviews and citations in your book description. Some publishers get in the habit of putting all of their review information, all their citations, endorsements, and things like that in their book description. And it, especially if you put it at the top of the description field, then it just makes it hard for someone who wants to read your book, or wants to read the book description to even know what the book is about. They're just reading reviews instead of reading a book description. So if you include a citation or any kind of, citations, endorsements or things, put them at the bottom of the book description, or even better, put them in the citation field in your data. So when you're sending your data out, it's actually structured in the way it needs to be. Another point about book descriptions is to kind of minimize the formatting. Some retailers will strip everything out, bold and italics and bulleted lists and numbered lists and things like that. But whatever you decide to do, it's important to try to keep your book description from being too complex. Don't put colored text or try to make font sizes larger or use headings or anything like that, because that's not going to be used very effectively on a lot of retail sites. So keep it very simple. Bold and italic is fine. If you have lists like bulleted lists or numbers lists, that's fine. Typically, some retailers will strip it out, but usually not the ones that you care about the most. So keep the formatting kind of basic if you can. And this is where formatting really does matter. If you don't put in the proper HTML behind the scenes in your metadata, then you can cause problems. So in this situation, this was a book that I saw online a couple of years ago. The publisher had put in some bold text here in their editorial reviews section. And on Amazon, they actually forgot to turn off the bold. They forgot to put in the code in here to turn off the bold formatting in this part of the text right here. And it ended up causing the rest of the page, not just the rest of the book, reviews, but the rest of the entire page on Amazon to be displayed in bold, just because they didn't provide the correct information there. So this is what it should have looked like. You can see that after the words everyday life, the bold should have ended, but it didn't end. Because of the way they put in the code. So this is very important to try to keep track of, when you're doing anything with bold and italic or things like that, try to watch for those and, make sure you're doing them correctly. I would say as well that the formatting still matters even with that fixed. There was also this other problem you could see where the paragraph, this paragraph was indented and this paragraph wasn't. So again, just more paragraph editing and HTML stuff. Depending on how you send your metadata out to your trading partners, your retail partners, you may not have to worry about this. But if you're doing it manually, if you're sending the data manually, then pay attention. If you're doing HTML at all, make sure that you're doing it properly. When you're thinking about HTML, and this may be really above everybody's head on the call, and that's perfectly fine, but it would be good for you as a publisher or as a metadata expert to get a little bit more comfortable using HTML in your metadata. These are the most essential HTML elements that you can use. But note that if you're writing HTML code, things like ampersands need to be encoded as an entity like this. So basically, what this comes down to is if you're providing your book metadata in Onyx, Onyx is the industry standard for sending out your data to retail partners, then it requires HTML. So you'll have to learn a little bit of HTML or use a tool that can create that file for you with HTML behind the scenes. And we can talk about that more during the Q&A. I do want to share another example of the kinds of issues that you'll deal with when you're sending out your metadata to retailers. So beyond all the requirements and the quirks of how different retailers will accept their metadata, they're not always consistent with how they interpret that HTML code that you provide behind the scenes. For example, one author bio in one of our example books looks fine on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, but Indigo, a Canadian retailer, had some issues importing their Onyx data, their book metadata. So let me zoom in for you on that bottom part. What happened was they removed the italics from the name of a book about, the author had written another book, and so it was put in italics, and they removed that italics, but they also removed all the spaces that were around that italics. And so it caused some problems with the book metadata because they were removing spaces in addition to removing italic code. So basically, again, watch your data, make sure it's being imported properly by the retail sites, but get comfortable with the HTML data as well. Okay, let's move on from book descriptions and talk about subject categories. Now, subjects are in the US, it's BISAC is the standard subject categorization system. In other parts of the world, Thema is the majority used in the other parts of the world. So we'll talk about this as kind of both of them. There was a study that was released by the Panorama Project in February of this year that showed that genre or category is the most important factor for book purchasing by far across all the different types. So you can see here, it's the big blue blob over on the right-hand side of our pie chart. The genre or the category of the book is the most important thing to consumers. And genre is basically user-friendly metadata. It's basically the types of information that people really want. So we all know that subject categories help retailers categorize your book. But of course, like everything else, most retailers have their own categorization systems. So where your book actually ends up is completely up to the mapping of the data you give them versus what they have as their structure. So you can see here that if you have, for example, an adult coloring book, which was really popular, 3 or 4 years ago, it might be put in the the games activity books BISAC category that you send out. But then Amazon puts it in maybe the drawing, coloring books for grown-ups, or maybe Amazon Canada puts it in humor and entertainment, and Powell's Books puts it in children's books because it's a coloring book and they don't have a category for adult coloring books. So this can really change, where your book shows up can really change depending on the retailer that the book is available in. So when you're thinking about what category you're going to provide for your book, or what categories you're going to provide for your book, make sure that you're picking ones that are going to be a good fit for the title, and be very picky about that. Thema categories are a really great way of kind of understanding how your book is categorized. Even if you're not selling your book in Europe or in other places that use Thema as categorization, it can be really helpful to use Thema as a baseline to kind of understand where your book should be categorized. The Thema categories, you'll notice if I'm looking at kind of my BISAC categorization list here, I'm looking at BISAC in the US, and I've got 3 different categories that I've chosen for my book about history, a history of Texas. And so I've got this kind of basic BISAC categories up here at the top. But then for Thema, the way Thema works is you have the categories that the book shows up in, but then you also have these things called qualifiers. And qualifiers can help put your book into other kind of subcategories in a sense, but help qualify the book in certain ways. So there's a placed qualifier that lets me say what part of the US or Canada or Europe or the world, what country, what area within that country does this apply to? There are Thema time period qualifiers. So what parts of time does this apply to? So this is a history book. So it has some, things about US exploration, expansion, Civil War, the Gilded Age, right? So it's talking about a lot of different time periods. And then also educational qualifiers. Does it apply to certain groups of people as far as education is concerned? And for my purposes for this history book, it's for all education levels. So, there's lots of different ways to kind of build out book categorization with Thema. And again, even if you're not selling your book in places that require Thema categories, this can be helpful for just you understanding your book better. Also, if you're familiar with BISAC and you want to kind of play around with Thema a little bit, then you can use the BISAC to Thema translator that's available from biblioshare.org to do an automatic conversion, to take those BISAC categories you're creating already and convert them to Thema, and it'll give you some recommendations for that. So if you're getting comfortable with that. All right, so let's talk about some best practices for categories. Again, you want to choose the categories that make the most sense for your book, because if you pick good categories, that'll help in the end. So choose 1 to 3 categories in order, put them in the order that you care about the most, with the best ones at the top. Try to use the latest category lists. So BISAC comes out with category lists once a year. Thema comes out with updates pretty often as well. So make sure you're picking those that are actually the most up to date. Don't use the general category if at all possible. So a lot of times you'll see books that just show up in the religion general or something like that. Try to be as specific as you can in your category. You also should not be mixing fiction and nonfiction categories, especially in BISAC. The way BISAC works, it's either fiction or it's nonfiction. It can't be both at the same time. And also, you shouldn't be mixing adult and juvenile or young adult all together. So pick, if it's an adult book, then pick adult categories. If it's a juvenile or YA book, then pick those categories. All right. A couple more slides here to walk through, and then we can take questions and talk about some things. So let's talk about some other important metadata that you might want to be aware of. So the first thing is the book excerpt. I do recommend putting in a book excerpt if you can in your data. The first chapter of the book, just a nice HTML, nothing too crazy, but something that helps people get a feel for how the book works. It is used on certain retailers like Barnes & Noble and Amazon here in the US. Review quotes and endorsements. We talked about those very briefly. I do recommend including reviews and endorsements. I typically call them citations of some kind, but basically reviews and endorsements help people see, oh, this book was reviewed in that journal that I care about, or is recommended by this other author that I like. So those are very helpful. It's good to have those and to put them into your book data as well. Now let's talk about keywords. And keywords are obviously an important thing, especially here in the US, in Amazon, but are helpful across the board. So let's talk about how keywords work. So the Nielsen UK study I mentioned at the beginning saw that 30 or more keywords significantly led to significantly more sales, average higher sales than books that didn't have keywords. So if you have keywords, you want to put in as many as you can, but 30 was a good number based on that UK study. Basically what it comes down to is that the more keywords you have, the more chances your book has to show up in more search queries on Amazon or anywhere else where keywords are used. The problem with keywords is that they're not used very extensively by retailers. They're used here in the US by Amazon. They're used on ebooks at Apple, but they're not really used by other ebook or print book retailers. So when you're thinking about your keywords, a lot of times people emphasize keywords way too much. They put more emphasis on the keywords than they do even on the book description. But yeah, as you saw earlier, book descriptions are actually more important in many ways than the keywords will be, at least on the kind of the broad range of different places you sell your book. So when you're thinking about keywords, let's talk about what is kind of the standard across the board. For Amazon will take up to 2,000 characters, but they only actually use the first 210 characters that you send them in your keyword information if you're sending it in Onyx. If you're not using Onyx to deliver to Amazon, if you're using Amazon Advantage or another system like that, you usually have 7 keyword fields that you can fill in. Basically, my recommendation is provide as many keywords as you can. Put in whatever keywords you're able to and try to filter them and put the best ones at the top of the list. So when you're thinking about keywords, don't duplicate other words. Don't say, well, the name of, if the word is already in the title of the book, then you don't have to put it in the keywords as well. If it's already in the book, in the author's name, you don't have to put it in the keywords itself. The exception to this is the book description, because a lot of times book descriptions are not used as keyword fodder. They're not used to help with search results. So you can use keywords in both the book description and the keywords field, and all of that data is fine. And the last point here about keywords, something to consider when you're thinking about building out your keyword list, is audience language. Think about how your audience thinks about your book, and because that's going to impact how they search for your book. So when you're trying to think about what keywords do I need, or what should I say in my book description, those types of things, how your audience thinks about the book is going to be helpful for writing those things out. So I would recommend, if you're going to come up with a good book description or come up with keywords, go read reviews of other books that are on the same topic, on the same subject. Go read, if you're going back and cleaning up data on a current book that's already been published for a while, go read your own reviews for that book. See what people say about the book, and then write keywords and book descriptions that match and pull in some of those points that are being made. If someone says, this book does a great job explaining the book of Mark to me in a way that I didn't understand. Well, why? How did they talk about that? What were the points that they made about that? Read the reviews and try to understand what people are saying about your book or about similar books from other publishers, and then use that to help you build out your descriptions and your keywords. All right, some final recommendation systems. And this first one, the question just came out, what's the best way to store your metadata? So a lot of times publishers, when they're just starting out, or they've only got a couple of titles, they don't really have a consistent system and a place to put their data. So my first suggestion for you, as we finish up the presentation part here, is that you put all your data in one place. Typically, that's some sort of metadata management system. It could be a database of some kind. But for a smaller publisher, if you've got 10 titles or something, Excel is a really common format. Just put it into an Excel file, or put it in Word documents. But Excel is a more common way to start collecting that information. You could even use a Google spreadsheet or something like that. Some sort of spreadsheet or database is usually the way that people structure their data. have a column for each and every item of data that you want to talk about, and each one of those items, just fill it in for each book, every book on an individual row. So that's a pretty common way to store the data. And when you start investing some time into doing that, putting the data in a structured way, as you grow, when you get bigger, it's going to be helpful to you to have it structured like that instead of just in PDFs on a tip sheet file or in a Word document or something like that. Because when you're starting to send your book data out more broadly, retail sites are going to want it. Typically, if you're sending it in some sort of file format, they're going to want it either in Excel or in Onyx. Onyx is an XML format that you don't need to worry about if you're very early in the process right now, but they're going to want it in a structured way. So think about it as structured data if you can. My second recommendation is to prioritize the metadata quality. The quality of the data you send out is very important. I argue that metadata is your company's most valuable non-people resource. So obviously your people are most important, but your metadata is a close second. And while different kinds of data are kind of becoming more and more important in publishing, none of that other data has a direct impact on your sales as much as metadata does. So provide better quality metadata, provide more metadata, and provide up-to-date metadata to the partners that sell your books. That's been shown to be the most effective approach to increasing your sales. Speaking of providing more metadata, that's my third recommendation. I highly recommend that you look at ways to increase the amount of metadata that you're sending out to partners. If you can, go ahead and send a book excerpt, that first chapter excerpt. Send out more reviews and endorsements. Send out a table of contents if you're able to, a better book description and other things like that, keywords and stuff like that. More is typically better. Even if some retailers don't use all the data that you're sending out more data can help them see that you're trying to give it to them in that form, and that's helpful to them to sell more books. My fourth suggestion is to update your metadata regularly. So the problem with a lot of publishers is that they let their metadata sit and sour. And we showed you before, I showed you a chart that was talking about backlist titles, and that 2 to 5 years out from publication is where a lot of backlist titles start to really pick up speed and have more sales. So your metadata is evergreen. I highly recommend that you go back on a regular basis and look at your data. An example of this is one publisher has told me that every month of the year, they look back at all the titles that they published in that month in the last 3 years, and they spend just a little bit of time updating the metadata and adding new and relevant information to those books. So even if you don't have that many books, you've got 5 books or 3 books, go back on a regular basis and just double check. Make sure that the data looks correct, that it has correct information, that it's looking good on the retail sites. Tweak things and make sure things have updates. Follow some sort of schedule, something that keeping your products relevant and allowing for better visibility and changes to come out. And then my last suggestion is to keep an eye on your titles in the marketplace. If you're able to go into the retail sites and learn more about, look at the different sites and say, what does it look like on Amazon? What does it look like on Barnes & Noble? What does it look like elsewhere? And try to get a feel for what's going on. Watch for those titles that are potentially problematic, and see if those are being followed properly. So looking at your titles in the marketplace can be very helpful. I haven't talked in this presentation very much about Onyx. And the reason for that is I know that most of you are very small publishers and you don't necessarily need to think about Onyx. If you're interested in digging in deeper to this topic, especially on the Onyx side and getting a lot of examples of the XML and the Onyx side of things, I did a study, I did a course on LinkedIn Learning called Learning Metadata for Book Publishers that goes into all of that and gives a lot of examples and talks about Onyx in a deeper way. So if you're on LinkedIn, you can sign up and watch that training. That'll go into a lot deeper. So that is the end of the presentation. We've got 10 minutes or so here for questions, and I've seen a couple of questions come in. If you have more questions or you want me to answer something, please put it into the chat box or into the Q&A, and we'll get to those. So someone asked, how do you prepare the metadata to send out to booksellers and websites? Do you just do a list of the items, or is there a format that you can share? So again, I mentioned before that typically retail sites are going to have one of three options available to you, depending on the type of account that you have with them. And if you're fairly new and fairly small, a lot of these are going to fit into the first category. And the first category is retailers that want you to fill out a form on their website. They don't want you to give them a file. They just want you to go in and fill out a form. What's the title of the book? What's the author's name? All that other information. So they're going to have you fill that form out for every book that you want to sell. That's a very common thing for small publishers to have available to them. So on their side, they just want you to have a form. However, internally, for you as a publisher, you're going to want to have some sort of structured data. Again, that's can be an Excel spreadsheet. It can be a Google spreadsheet. It can be a Word document if you want it to be. But it can be it needs to be something where your data is all in one place. I usually recommend Excel or Google Sheets just because then the data is in a consistent location for all of your books. You don't have to go to different places for different books. So put it all in there and then have it worked out, have it looking good and everything's cleaned up, so that when you go and you have to fill out that form on a new website, a new retailer that's going to sell your book, you'll have the ability to do that. The second way that publishers will take or retailers will take your data is Excel. There are quite a few retailers out there that will accept an Excel file. The difference is that they're going to require you to give it to them with certain columns in a certain order. So they're going to say, we want your first column to be the ISBN, the second column to be the title, third column to be the author name, right? Things like that. And every one of those different retailers that accepts an Excel file will probably have a different format for that. So you may have have to create different Excel formats for different retailers if you go that route. But again, if you have it in Excel already for yourself and you have it in a consistent form, then creating those different files when you need to shouldn't be as difficult as it might be otherwise. And then the third way that retailers take data is Onyx. Onyx is, I mentioned, an XML format. Typically, publishers don't create Onyx themselves. You're not going to go in and code in XML in Onyx. It's too much work. So typically, you'll use some sort of system to send that data out to your partners. Typically, you start having to think about Onyx when you've got about 100 titles or so. That's about the point at which a publisher starts to need some sort of Onyx delivery service. Firebrand offers a delivery service. This is not a sales thing, though, so I'm not going to talk to you about that. There's other tools like Onyx Edit and Onyx Suite and some others that are out there that are available to you. But basically, as you get bigger as a publisher, when you get into that 100 titles or so range, that's the point at which some of your partners will start to ask you for Onyx, or they'll give you the option of giving them Onyx instead of filling out a form on their website. So it's really driven by what the retail partners are going to be asking for from you. So I would recommend kind of keeping track of that. The biggest thing that you'll run into as a publisher, especially if you're a small publisher and just starting out, or if you've been around but you still have only a couple of books, the biggest thing you're going to run into is that most retailers want to receive your data from you directly. They don't want or directly from a distributor. So if you have a distributor, your distributor will handle the metadata delivery for you. And that's a great way, if you can get traditional distribution of your titles through a standard distributor, and maybe even in different countries have different distributors in different countries or different areas of the world. The distributors will handle that for you. So you provide the data to the distributor and they send the data out. And a lot of distributors offer sales as well. So if you sign up with a distributor here in the US, for example, they will offer to sell your book to the bookstores as well. And they'll put your book along with all the other books that they sell, and they'll try to encourage booksellers to purchase copies of your book or put copies of your book on their bookshelves. So distributors will often handle that for you and handle the process. You don't have to mess with it, and you're just providing the data to them as best you can. So,
Joshua,
yes.
a distributor is the same as aggregator?
Mm-mm. No, there's that's two different categories. So a book distributor actually is a partner with the publisher. They're the ones that have a warehouse. Your books sit in their warehouse. They sell the book to the different retail stores and put the
That's
book up for sale.
physical
That
distribution, right?
that's physical distribution.
What
Yep.
about the
And
aggregator? Would they handle your metadata for you, or?
Not really. So aggregators are typically in their own business. They sell the metadata to different places. So for example, here in the US, Bowker is a metadata aggregator. They're also the ISBN registrar, but they aggregate data from all over the place, from publishers and everybody else they can get data from. And then they sell that data to retail stores like Amazon and Barnes and Noble and whoever else. The problem is that their data may not be as up to date as data coming directly from a publisher. If you think back to that chart I showed before, you know, the ideal here is that you as a publisher control your data and you send it everywhere it needs to go. If an aggregator gets in the way, they may get a data feed from you, but they may have already sent, you know, maybe sending out, you know, data that's out of date. So aggregators are not necessarily the best source to rely on for getting your data where it needs to go. I don't recommend putting your reliance on that. I would recommend doing your own data delivery where you can, to retail partners yourself, and then, you know, separately from that, you know, going through a distributor if you have your distributor set up.
Very good. Thank you so much. That's
Yeah.
very helpful. Do we have other questions from our participants? Please type your questions in the Q&A or comments in the chat box.
Yeah, I hope that I hope that this wasn't, you know, that you guys don't feel that this was too high of a level, and you feel out of sorts or something with the information here. My goal was to help you understand a little bit more about how data is important and how data can, you know, be used. When it comes to book publishing, there's obviously uh, a lot of differences depending on how big you are as a publisher and those kinds of things. If you're brand new and you're just starting out and you've got just one or two books or under 10, you know, fewer than 10 books, um, a lot of time the biggest issue is just trying to make sure that you have the visibility where people will buy your book. So you need to think deeply about where's my target market? Who is it that I want to sell this book to? And if that is pastors in different parts of the world, then put the book up for sale in stores where pastors go and shop. That may be a place like Christian Book Distributor here in the US, or christianbook.com. It may be Amazon in different places. It may be that you need to focus on a market that isn't the US because the book is more appropriately sold in other places. Maybe your focus is on missionaries. Well, they may not be going to US bookstores or US online retailers to purchase their books. Where do they go and buy books? And so you have to think about how that works and where the books can go, where the books will be sold. I would also recommend just talking, you know, a lot of publishers try to sell everything just on their own website. I recommend against that if you can avoid it, because you're relying on Google to show your website to people instead of putting your book where they actually will go look for books. So if you can get your book up for sale in different retail stores, that would be the best way to do it, just because that's where people look for books. Catherine is asking, are there any tools that can assist with extracting keywords? There aren't any tools that I know of. There are services that offer that. There's also just there's some really good documentation out there. The Book Industry Study Group here in the US published a report a couple of years ago. I was on the committee that came out with the report on how to create keywords, on what keywords are and how they work. But also there's a lot of information there about, you know, kind of practical information for how to create a keywords list. A lot of times, I mentioned in the presentation, it comes down to looking at the reviews of your book or reviews of similar books and learning what the audience says about your book, trying to understand the words that they use, the phrases that they use, and take that as fodder for some of your keywords.
So
But yeah,
keywords can be key phrases,
yes,
not just
yeah,
single word.
I say keyword, but really it's a keyword phrase is typically what it is.
Very good.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, other questions? I think you've made it clear to us, kind of complex topic, but we have a better understanding of what metadata is, and we're not so afraid of it.
Yeah.
I guess
Good.
it's the discipline of keeping and maintaining the metadata that you have. As you said, it's the most valuable non-people resource. publisher would have. I mean,
Yeah.
in the Internet of Things, and if you are visible in the internet,
Yeah.
you have to keep maintaining good quality metadata.
You do.
Mhm.
And that applies whether you're selling on your own website or selling on Amazon or selling anywhere else. The metadata that you have is how people find your book. So if
Mhm.
you want them to find it, they have to be able to learn about it, and that's where the metadata comes into play.
Very good. Thank you so much. I don't see any more questions from the floor. Uh,
Okay.
Thank you, Sam, for your comment. It's a great presentation from Sam in Ghana. Thank you for that. George Latte from Benin is thanking you, Josh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, another. Okay.
So yeah, Sam's a good question, Sam. Sam asked, would you encourage having different metadata for different retailers? It depends on kind of what different retailers you're putting a book into. If I were writing a book description for a book that's say a commentary on the book of Acts or something, I might write something a little differently for a Christian retailer than I would necessarily for a secular retailer, just because of the kind of the nature of the retailer itself. There's also sometimes, again, when you're thinking about how does the data look on different retail sites, some retailers don't show your review quotes, your endorsements as a separate field. They require you to put that in the book description field. So in a case like that, you would have to provide them with a book description field that has those review quotes and maybe even the author bio all together. So it all depends a little bit on kind of what the retailer requires. But yeah, I would think about that if especially if the book is very specific and you think that this retailer over here is going to benefit from different keywords or different book description or something like that, then that would be fine. I would definitely recommend keeping your title of your book and your author name and everything else consistent, regardless of where that's available. Never change those kind of foundational pieces of data. Only things like book descriptions and keywords really need to be different potentially for different sites.
Thank you.
Cool.
Okay. Joshua, would you share your final thoughts, your final words of encouragement to our
Yeah.
participants from around the world?
Yeah, I understand this can be a very difficult topic sometimes for publishers to get, especially if your focus is on publishing good books, right? Your goal is really to publish as many good quality books as you can, and so sometimes the data can just get in the way. It can be confusing or it can be frustrating to work with. Don't get frustrated. I would recommend just set up systems, set up a process, take advantage of these best practices that I mentioned in the presentation. Ramon's going to send you guys also a list of the kind of a list of metadata fields that you should be considering, things you should be thinking about. So when you're coming up with your plan for your metadata, how you're going to engage that data, just be encouraged that this is something that is an ever growing, ever changing field. There's always more to learn, so don't get too frustrated with it. Just play around with it and try to get used to it, and you'll see what works for you over time, both as a publisher and also as someone who sells your books.
Thank you. We'll send out that document of the list of items that you should be thinking of for your metadata. I've asked Joshua to edit that and to complete that, so he sent me a complete list of metadata fields that you should be putting in your Excel, right?
Yep.
And preparing those and maintaining those regularly. So
Yep.
thank you so much. Thank you for your comments. Ida, Susan, Laura, thank you for being here in your appreciation of Joshua's presentation. And yeah, thank you for joining us today. I think we have our final just invitation from MEI. Let me share my screen. So yeah, MEI is inviting you to enter our second writing contest related to Lit World 2022. In anticipation of the conference in Hungary, LitWorld 2022 in April, MEI invites you to participate in the second writing contest related to the conference theme, Stronger Together, Publishing Hope Beyond Crisis. So send in your entries. The topic is Hope Beyond Crisis. Describe a time when a Christian friend gave you hope when you most needed it. And we will accept entries until the end of November. Of course, if you're planning, we are encouraging you to come to LitWorld 2022 in Hungary. Visit our website for the writing contest, and for LitWorld, that's litworld.org. So thank you so much. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your expertise. It's been very helpful, very informative, and I hope our friends would start keeping good quality metadata and updating them and putting them out so the books can be discovered, bought, and read globally. Thank you, friends, and we hope to see you again next month for our next MEI webinar. Good day, and God bless you all. Bye for now.